Imagine sitting quietly on a park bench on a calm American morning, doing nothing more than feeding a few birds, when suddenly someone with authority decides that even that simple moment needs permission. The sun had barely climbed over the trees in Jefferson Park, painting long golden shadows across the walking path, and the air still carried the cool softness of early morning. A few joggers moved past at an easy pace, their sneakers brushing softly against the pavement, while the distant hum of traffic from the main road blended with the rustle of leaves overhead. On an old wooden bench near a small fountain sat a man named Marcus Bennett, a tall black man in his late 60s with calm eyes and steady hands. He wore a faded brown jacket and a simple baseball cap pulled low against the morning light. Resting beside him was a small paper bag filled with birdseed. Every few seconds Marcus reached into the bag and scattered a handful of seeds onto the grass a few feet away. The pigeons had already learned the routine. They gathered carefully at first, hopping forward one step at a time, tilting their heads as if making sure the coast was clear. Then, slowly, they began pecking at the seeds, their wings occasionally fluttering in soft bursts that broke the quiet stillness of the park. Marcus watched them with a patient smile, the kind of peaceful expression people wear when they have nothing left to prove to the world. For him, mornings like this had become a quiet ritual. 30 minutes on that bench, a few handfuls of seeds, a moment of calm before the rest of the city fully woke up. But peace has a strange way of attracting attention when someone believes they control the rules. A police cruiser rolled slowly along the park access road, tires crunching lightly against loose gravel. Inside sat Officer Daniel Carter, a young white patrol officer who had only been assigned to this district a few months earlier. Carter prided himself on keeping order. At least that was how he described it. His eyes scanned the park automatically as the cruiser crept forward, searching for something that looked out of place. And that was when he saw Marcus sitting on the bench, surrounded by birds. Carter's cruiser slowed even more. His gaze narrowed slightly. To most people it looked like nothing at all, just an older man feeding pigeons in a public park. But to Carter, it was suddenly something that needed his attention. He pulled the cruiser to the curb and stepped out, adjusting the radio on his shoulder as he walked toward the bench. The pigeons noticed him first. Birds are often better judges of tension than people. A few flapped their wings and lifted into the air, circling once above the trees before settling again nearby. Marcus remained seated, calmly dropping another small handful of seeds onto the grass. Officer Carter approached with the kind of confidence that comes from wearing a badge and believing it gives you the final word in every conversation. He stopped a few feet from the bench, his shadow stretching across the ground toward Marcus and the scattered seeds. The park suddenly felt quieter than it had a moment earlier, as if the entire morning had paused to watch what would happen next. Carter looked down at the birds, then at the paper bag, and finally at Marcus himself. And in a voice that carried just enough authority to turn a peaceful moment into a tense one, the officer spoke. What happened next would change the entire tone of that quiet morning in a way Officer Daniel Carter never expected. Officer Daniel Carter let the silence hang for a moment as he looked at the birds gathering around the scattered seeds. His boots rested firmly on the gravel path, his hands settled on the thick black belt around his waist where his radio and equipment were clipped. He tilted his head slightly, studying the older man on the bench as if trying to decide whether what he was seeing was harmless or a problem that needed correcting. Marcus Bennett remained seated, calm and unhurried, releasing another small handful of seeds into the grass. The pigeons fluttered closer again, their gray wings catching flashes of sunlight as they landed. Carter finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. "Sir, you cannot be feeding wildlife in the park." Marcus lifted his eyes slowly toward the officer, the same quiet expression still resting on his face. He glanced down briefly at the birds, then back toward Carter as if he had heard this kind of statement many times before. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said gently. "I did not realize a few seeds were causing trouble." Carter shifted, his stance slightly, his expression tightening. "It is not about trouble. It is about rules. Feeding birds encourages them to gather. Then they make a mess. Then the city gets complaints." Marcus nodded slowly, considering the explanation while another pigeon hopped closer to his shoe. "I see," he replied calmly. "I have been sitting here for about 20 minutes. They seem well behaved." Carter did not smile at the comment. Instead, he looked around the park, noticing that two joggers had slowed slightly as they passed, and a woman walking her small dog had paused on the far side of the path. People had begun paying attention. That alone seemed to strengthen Carter's tone. "I am going to need you to stand up, sir," Carter said. "And I will also need to see some identification." Marcus did not move right away. He gently folded the top of the small paper bag and rested it beside him on the bench. The birds continued pecking at the seeds scattered across the grass, unaware that the calm moment around them had begun shifting into something more tense. Marcus looked up at Carter again, his voice remaining steady and respectful. "Officer, may I ask something first?" Carter crossed his arms loosely. "What is that?" Marcus glanced briefly toward the badge on Carter's uniform, reading the name stitched above the pocket. "How long have you been working in this district?" The question caught Carter slightly off guard. It was not the response he had expected. "That is not important," Carter replied quickly. "What is important is that I asked you to stand up." Marcus slowly rose from the bench without argument. He stood tall, nearly the same height as the officer, though his posture carried the relaxed balance of someone who had long ago learned patience. The pigeons scattered briefly at the movement, circling once before settling again near the grass. Carter continued watching Marcus carefully now. Something about the man's calmness seemed to make the situation feel less simple than it had a moment ago. Most people reacted differently when confronted by authority. Some argued. Some apologized quickly. Some hurried away. Marcus Bennett did none of those things. Instead, he brushed a small bit of dust from the sleeve of his jacket and looked around the park as if appreciating the quiet morning one more time. A light breeze moved through the trees, sending a few leaves drifting slowly onto the walking path. Carter cleared his throat. "Identification, sir," he repeated. Marcus nodded once. "Of course." He reached slowly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. Carter watched the movement carefully, his eyes following Marcus's hand. The older man pulled out a worn leather wallet, the edges softened from years of use. He held it for a moment before opening it. From where Carter stood, he could only see the glint of a card inside. Marcus paused briefly, glancing once more at the birds gathering near his feet. Then he looked back at Officer Carter and spoke in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. "You know," Marcus said quietly, "this department used to teach something very important during training." Carter frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" Marcus slowly slid the card from his wallet, holding it between two fingers as the morning light touched the faded surface. "Respect," Marcus said. It was always the first lesson. Carter reached forward to take the card, already preparing to glance at the identification and in what he assumed was a simple conversation. But the moment his eyes focused on the lettering printed across the old badge identification card, the confident expression on his face began to change. Officer Daniel Carter held the identification card between his fingers for a moment longer than expected. At first, he only glanced at it the way officers do during routine checks, quickly scanning for a name and date of birth. But then his eyes moved back to the top of the card, and something about the lettering made him pause. The confident posture in his shoulders shifted slightly. The card did not look like a standard driver license. It was older, heavier, the kind issued by a department many years ago. Carter narrowed his eyes and read the name again slowly. Marcus Bennett. Beneath the name was an official seal that had faded with time, but was still clearly recognizable to anyone who worked in law enforcement. Carter's brow tightened as he read the line printed beneath the seal. Chief of Police. Retired. For a moment he said nothing. The sounds of the park continued quietly around them. A breeze moved through the trees. The pigeons resumed pecking at the scattered seeds as if nothing unusual had happened. A jogger passed along the path, but slowed slightly, sensing the strange silence between the two men. Carter looked up from the card and studied Marcus again, this time more carefully. The calm posture, the steady eyes, the quiet patience in the way the older man stood without any sign of frustration. Marcus Bennett simply waited. He did not rush the moment. He did not demand an apology. He only watched the officer read the card again. Carter cleared his throat softly. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though his voice had lost the sharp authority it carried earlier. Marcus answered without hesitation. "The department issued it to me when I retired." Carter's eyes dropped back to the card once more. The date printed near the bottom showed that Marcus Bennett had served more than 3 decades in the same police department Carter now worked for. 32 years. Carter felt the weight of that number settle in his mind. 32 years of patrol shifts, investigations, long nights, and decisions that shaped the department itself. The same department whose badge Carter wore on his chest. Carter looked back toward Marcus, studying him with a new expression now. You were Chief Bennett. Marcus gave a small nod. Yes, a long time ago. The officer's grip on the identification card loosened slightly. For the first time since stepping out of his cruiser, Carter seemed uncertain about what to say next. He glanced briefly toward the birds gathering at Marcus's feet, then toward the small paper bag resting on the bench. The scene suddenly looked different through his eyes. The quiet man feeding birds in the park was no longer just an elderly stranger. Carter handed the card back slowly. I did not recognize you, he said. Marcus accepted the card and placed it gently back into his wallet. That is understandable, Marcus replied calmly. Time has a way of changing faces. Another pigeon fluttered down beside the bench, its wings stirring a faint swirl of dust in the sunlight. Carter shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around the park again. A couple walking along the path had slowed nearby, pretending to watch the fountain while quietly listening to the exchange. Carter lowered his voice slightly now. I was just doing my job. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the statement carefully before answering. Of course, he said. Every officer believes that. Carter waited for the older man to say more, but Marcus simply looked out across the park for a moment, watching the birds move across the grass. Then he spoke again in the same calm tone that had never once changed during the entire encounter. Tell me something, Officer Carter, Marcus said quietly. When you approached that bench a few minutes ago, what exactly did you think you were seeing? Carter opened his mouth slightly, but did not answer right away. The question hung in the air between them like a mirror being held up to the moment that had just passed. Officer Daniel Carter did not answer immediately. The question seemed simple, yet it carried a weight that settled quietly in his chest. Just minutes earlier the situation had felt routine, almost automatic. An older man on a bench, birds gathering around him, a small bag of seeds. Carter had approached with the certainty that he already understood the scene. But now, standing a few feet away from Marcus Bennett, that certainty had begun to unravel. Carter shifted his gaze toward the grass where the pigeons continued pecking calmly at the scattered seeds. One of them hopped closer to the bench, tilting its head as if studying the two men the same way Carter had studied Marcus earlier. The officer inhaled slowly before answering. I saw someone feeding wildlife in the park, Carter said carefully. Marcus listened without interrupting. Carter continued, though his voice sounded less confident now. The city has guidelines about that. Birds gather, people complain, sanitation gets involved. It becomes a problem. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the explanation the same way a teacher listens to a student thinking through an answer. So you saw a problem, Marcus said. Yes, Carter replied. Marcus glanced down toward the birds again. And before speaking to me, you were already certain what kind of person I was. Carter frowned slightly. I did not say that. Marcus looked back at him with calm eyes that carried years of quiet experience. You did not have to say it. The breeze moved through the park again, rustling the leaves overhead. The small fountain nearby continued its steady rhythm, water spilling gently over the stone edge. A woman walking her dog paused briefly near the path, pretending to adjust the leash while listening to the conversation. Carter noticed the attention and straightened his posture instinctively. But something about the moment made it difficult for him to return to the confident tone he had used earlier. Marcus reached for the small paper bag resting on the bench and opened the folded top again. He poured another small handful of seeds onto the grass. The pigeons fluttered forward eagerly, their wings brushing softly through the morning air. You know, Marcus said quietly, watching the birds gather. During my years in the department we used to train young officers to pause before assuming anything. Carter listened without speaking. Marcus continued in the same steady voice. When you wear a badge, people expect two things from you: authority and judgment. Authority comes with the uniform. Judgment comes from experience. Carter shifted slightly, his boots scraping lightly against the gravel path. I have experience, he said. Marcus looked at him thoughtfully. You have time on the job, Marcus replied. Experience is something different. The officer felt the words settle deeper than he expected. Marcus did not sound angry. He did not sound accusatory. If anything, His voice carried a tone of quiet disappointment that seemed heavier than any argument could have been. Carter glanced again at the birds. You were feeding them every morning? Marcus nodded. Most mornings. About 30 minutes before the city fully wakes up. Carter studied the older man again. Why? Marcus smiled faintly. Because they come back. Carter did not understand at first. Marcus gestured lightly toward the pigeons. You see those birds? He said. They remember small kindnesses. Even something as simple as a few seeds on a quiet morning. Carter followed the motion of Marcus's hand, watching the pigeons circle and settle again on the grass. Marcus then turned his attention back to the officer. People are not very different, he continued softly. They remember how they were treated. Carter stood silent as the meaning behind the words slowly unfolded in his mind. The park remained peaceful around them, but the moment had changed. What began as a simple stop over a bag of birdseed had quietly turned into something far more uncomfortable. Marcus Bennett brushed his hands together lightly, removing the last few grains of seed from his fingers. Then he looked directly at Officer Carter again and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding what a badge truly meant. So I will ask you again, Officer Carter, Marcus said gently. When you first walked toward that bench, what exactly did you think you were seeing? Officer Daniel Carter remained silent after Marcus Bennett asked the question again. The words seemed simple, but they echoed in the quiet morning air with a weight that was impossible to ignore. Carter looked away for a moment, his eyes drifting across the park as if searching for an answer somewhere beyond the bench. A man pushing a stroller moved slowly along the walking path about 20 yards away. Two pigeons fluttered up to a nearby tree branch and settled there, watching the ground below as if waiting for the next handful of seeds. The world around them continued as normal, yet the conversation standing in the middle of that peaceful park had become something far more serious than a routine interaction. Carter finally exhaled quietly. I thought I saw someone breaking a rule, he said. Marcus studied him carefully. Only a rule? Marcus asked gently. Carter hesitated again. The truth inside that moment was more complicated than the simple explanation he had given. When he first stepped out of the cruiser, he had not only seen birdseed and pigeons. He had also seen an older black man sitting alone on a park bench. That detail had shaped the entire way he approached the situation before a single word had even been spoken. Carter rubbed the back of his neck slightly as the realization began forming in his mind. I thought I saw someone who needed to be corrected, he admitted quietly. Marcus nodded slowly, not as if he had won an argument, but as if he had been expecting that answer all along. Correction can be important, Marcus said calmly. But the question every officer must ask first is whether the correction is truly necessary. Carter glanced toward the bench again where the small paper bag rested. The seeds scattered across the grass had nearly disappeared as the pigeons finished their meal. The scene now looked harmless, simple, peaceful, and yet only minutes earlier Carter had approached it as if it were a disturbance. Marcus reached down and folded the paper bag closed once more. When I joined the department, Marcus continued, my first training captain told me something I never forgot. Carter listened closely now. Marcus's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had repeated this lesson many times before. He said that a badge is not a tool for controlling people. It is a responsibility to protect the dignity of every person you meet. Carter lowered his eyes slightly. Marcus continued, his tone never rising above the calm rhythm it had carried from the beginning. Every officer eventually faces moments where a decision must be made in seconds. The way you approach someone, the assumptions you bring into that moment, the respect you show before you even know who they are. Carter slowly nodded, absorbing the meaning behind the words. A light breeze drifted through the park again, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and damp pavement from the early morning dew. Marcus looked out across the park for a moment before speaking again. You know something interesting about retirement? He said softly. Carter glanced at him. What is that? Marcus smiled faintly. People stop recognizing you. The uniform disappears. The title fades. And suddenly you get to see how the world treats you when nobody believes you hold authority. Carter understood the point immediately. The lesson unfolding in front of him had nothing to do with birdseed or park rules. Marcus Bennett brushed a few remaining grains from his palm and looked back toward the officer. This morning I was simply an older man sitting on a bench, Marcus said quietly. And that was enough for you to decide what kind of situation you were dealing with. Carter felt the weight of those words settle deeply inside him. Marcus's voice remained steady, not accusing, not angry, simply honest. But the truth is, Marcus continued, every person you approach carries a story you cannot see. Carter looked at the pigeons one more time as they circled above the trees before landing again on the grass. Marcus Bennett then met his eyes with a calm but unmistakable seriousness. The question every officer must learn to ask, Marcus said gently, is whether they are protecting the law or simply protecting their assumptions. Officer Daniel Carter stood quietly as the words settled into the space between them. The morning sunlight had climbed a little higher now, warming the pavement and casting brighter reflections across the small fountain nearby. The park had grown slightly busier as more people arrived to begin their day. A man in a blue sweatshirt walked past with a coffee cup in one hand. A young woman jogged slowly along the path with headphones resting around her neck. Yet none of them truly understood the quiet shift taking place between the two men standing near the bench. Carter kept his eyes lowered for a moment, replaying the last several minutes in his mind. The way he stepped out of the cruiser, the tone of his voice, the assumption that the situation in front of him required correction. And now, standing face to face with a man who had once carried the responsibility of leading the entire department, Carter felt something unfamiliar pressing against his confidence. It was not fear. It was something closer to realization. Marcus Bennett did not move from where he stood. His posture remained calm, patient, almost reflective. He had seen this moment happen many times before during his years in uniform. Not this exact situation, perhaps, but the moment when a young officer began to understand that authority alone did not make a good decision. Marcus looked out across the park again, watching the pigeons circle lazily above the trees before settling back onto the grass. You know, Marcus said softly, the hardest lesson for most officers is not learning how to enforce the law. Carter lifted his eyes slightly, listening carefully. Marcus continued, the hardest lesson is learning when not to. Carter frowned slightly as he considered the statement. For years the academy had drilled procedures into his mind. Identify the situation. Establish control. Apply the rules. But standing here now, the simplicity of that process suddenly felt incomplete. Marcus turned his gaze back toward the officer. Every day in this job you will meet people whose lives you know nothing about, he said. You see them for only a moment. Sometimes just a few minutes. Carter nodded slowly. Marcus's voice remained steady and thoughtful. In that short moment, the way you approach them becomes the entire story they will remember about the law. Carter glanced again toward the small paper bag of seeds resting on the bench. Only a few grains remained now. The pigeons had nearly finished everything Marcus had scattered. A child walking with his father pointed toward the birds, smiling as they fluttered across the grass. The scene looked peaceful again, as if the tension that had filled the air earlier had quietly faded away. Carter spoke carefully now. I thought I was doing the right thing. Marcus nodded. Most officers believe that in the moment, he replied. Intent is important, but impact is what people remember. Carter absorbed that sentence slowly. It carried the kind of clarity that only years of experience could shape. Marcus stepped closer to the bench and picked up the small paper bag. He folded the top neatly and held it in his hand. During my years leading the department, Marcus continued, I used to remind officers of a simple truth. Carter waited. Marcus looked directly at him. A badge does not give you the right to assume the worst about someone, he said calmly. It gives you the responsibility to discover the truth before you judge them. Carter stood very still. The weight of the conversation had changed the atmosphere around them. The morning no longer felt like an ordinary patrol stop. It felt like a quiet lesson unfolding in real time. Marcus glanced once more at the pigeons before returning his attention to the young officer. You saw an older man feeding birds, Marcus said gently. But what you really saw was an opportunity to decide how you treat people when no one expects anything from you. Carter met Marcus's eyes now, no longer avoiding the moment. The older man's expression carried neither anger nor resentment, only a calm expectation that the lesson would be understood. And in the quiet center of Jefferson Park, surrounded by fluttering wings and early morning sunlight, Officer Daniel Carter began to realize that the smallest encounters often reveal the deepest truths about the kind of officer someone chooses to become. Officer Daniel Carter remained standing beside the bench, the morning sun now fully lighting the open space of Jefferson Park. The moment had slowed into something reflective, almost quiet enough that even the sound of wings fluttering above the grass seemed louder than usual. Carter looked down at the ground where the last few seeds were disappearing beneath the quick movements of the pigeons. Just minutes ago, he had walked toward this bench with complete certainty. Now he felt something different settling in his thoughts. It was the uncomfortable awareness that the situation he believed he understood had never truly been what he imagined. Marcus Bennett watched the young officer carefully, not with judgment, but with the steady patience of someone who had spent decades observing how people grow through moments exactly like this one. The retired chief had seen hundreds of officers stand where Carter now stood. Some learned quickly, others took years. A few never understood at all. Marcus placed the folded paper bag back onto the bench beside him and rested his hands loosely at his sides. "Tell me something honestly, Officer Carter," Marcus said calmly. Carter lifted his head slightly. "Yes, sir." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the respectful tone. "When you stepped out of your cruiser and saw me sitting here, did you see a man enjoying a quiet morning, or did you see someone who needed to be controlled?" The question landed quietly but firmly. Carter did not rush to answer. He looked across the park again, noticing details he had ignored earlier. The father guiding his child along the path. The sunlight reflecting off the fountain water. The pigeons hopping across the grass without fear. Everything about the scene was peaceful. Yet when he first arrived, he had approached it like a disturbance. Carter inhaled slowly before speaking. "I thought I saw someone ignoring the rules," he said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "And that made you certain the situation required authority?" Carter nodded faintly. "Yes." Marcus studied him for a moment, then looked down toward the birds again. "Authority is one of the most misunderstood tools in policing," Marcus said quietly. "People believe it means control, but true authority is something different." Carter listened closely now. Marcus continued in the calm voice that carried the weight of many years in service. "Real authority comes from restraint. From knowing when your presence is enough without turning every moment into a command." Carter felt the truth in those words immediately. The encounter replayed again in his mind. The sharp tone in his voice. The way he demanded identification before even asking a simple question. Marcus stepped slightly closer to the bench and rested one hand lightly on the back of it. "During my years as chief," Marcus said, "I met officers who believed every situation required them to prove something." Carter looked at him with curiosity. "Prove what?" Marcus smiled faintly. "That they were in charge." Carter lowered his eyes again. Marcus continued gently. "But the strongest officers I ever worked with understood something very important. They did not need to prove their authority because their character already carried it." The breeze shifted again across the park, stirring a small cloud of feathers as two pigeons lifted into the air and circled above the trees. Carter watched them rise, feeling the tension inside him slowly transform into reflection. Marcus Bennett looked at the young officer with a calm but thoughtful expression. "This job will give you thousands of encounters," Marcus said. "Some will last seconds. Some will stay with you for years." Carter listened quietly. Marcus's voice softened slightly. "The question every officer must ask after each encounter is simple. Did I make that moment better for the person I met, or worse?" Carter did not answer right away. The weight of that question felt heavier than the badge on his uniform. Marcus reached into the paper bag and shook out the final few seeds onto the grass. The pigeons immediately gathered again, their wings fluttering softly in the sunlight. Marcus watched them for a moment before speaking again. "You cannot control how every person behaves," he said calmly. "But you can always control the respect you bring into the moment." Carter slowly nodded. Standing there in the quiet center of the park, surrounded by the ordinary rhythm of a peaceful morning, he understood that the encounter he thought was routine had quietly become one of the most important lessons of his young career. Officer Daniel Carter remained beside the bench, the conversation settling into the quiet rhythm of the park around them. The sunlight now stretched across the open grass, warming the stone walkway and reflecting softly off the small fountain nearby. People continued moving through the park, most of them unaware that a moment of quiet reflection was unfolding only a few steps away. Carter looked down at the ground again where the final seeds had disappeared. The pigeons had finished their meal and now wandered calmly across the grass. occasionally fluttering their wings before settling again. For the first time since he had stepped out of the cruiser, Carter felt the urge to slow down his thoughts rather than rush to the next action. Marcus Bennett noticed the change. The retired chief had seen this shift before in many younger officers. It was the moment when the noise of authority faded and the weight of responsibility finally began to settle in. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the back of the bench and looked toward the path where a father and his young son had stopped to watch. The birds. The child laughed quietly as one pigeon hopped closer to his shoe. The simple joy of that small moment seemed to carry a lesson of its own. Marcus turned his attention back to Carter. "You know," Marcus said calmly, "most people believe respect is something you give only after it is earned." Carter listened carefully. Marcus shook his head slightly. "But in this profession, it works the other way around. Respect must come first." Carter looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Even when someone might be breaking a rule?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "Especially then." Carter considered that answer for a moment. Marcus continued in the same steady tone. "When people feel respected, they listen differently. Conversations change. Situations calm down before they ever become problems." Carter glanced again toward the bench where Marcus had been sitting earlier. It now seemed almost strange that such a peaceful moment had turned into tension so quickly. Marcus reached down and picked up the empty paper bag. He folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. "There is something else most officers learn over time," Marcus said. Carter looked back toward him. "What is that?" Marcus smiled faintly. "The badge does not make people trust you. Your actions do." Carter felt the truth of that sentence settle deep inside his mind. In the academy, instructors had spoken about community trust many times. But standing here in the middle of the park, the meaning of those words finally felt real. Marcus gestured lightly toward the open space around them. "Every person who saw this interaction today will remember it in their own way," he said. Carter followed his gaze and noticed again the couple walking slowly along the path, and the father still standing with his son near the grass. Marcus continued gently. "Some of them may not know who I am. They may not know anything about my years in the department, but they do know how an officer approached someone sitting quietly on a bench." Carter nodded slowly. The realization made his chest feel heavier than before. Marcus did not say this to embarrass him. His tone remained calm, almost encouraging. "The good news is that every day gives you another chance to show people what the badge truly represents," Marcus said. Carter looked at the older man with growing respect. "I understand that." "Now," he replied quietly. Marcus studied him for a moment and seemed satisfied that the lesson had reached its mark. The retired chief then glanced once more toward the pigeons as they fluttered lightly across the grass before settling again near the fountain. The peaceful rhythm of the park had returned completely. Marcus Bennett placed both hands in his jacket pockets and spoke one final thought in the same calm voice that had guided the entire conversation. "The strongest officers are not remembered for how loudly they enforce the law," he said gently. "They are remembered for how wisely they carry it." Officer Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the bench, watching the morning unfold around him. Knowing that the lesson he had just received would stay with him far longer than the routine patrol he thought he was beginning. Officer Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the bench as the morning in Jefferson Park continued unfolding around them. The sunlight had grown warmer now, spreading across the grass and catching the silver ripples of the fountain nearby. A gentle breeze moved through the tall oak trees, carrying the soft rustling sound of leaves that blended with the distant hum of the city beginning its day. The pigeons that had gathered earlier were now scattered across the lawn, pecking lazily at the last invisible crumbs of seed. What had started as a simple stop during patrol had turned into something far more meaningful, and Carter could feel that truth settling deeper in his thoughts with every passing second. Marcus Bennett stood calmly near the bench, the empty paper bag resting inside the pocket of his jacket. He did not look like a man who had once carried the authority of an entire police department. To anyone passing by, he appeared to be exactly what Carter had first assumed he was, an older man enjoying a quiet morning in the park. Yet that was precisely the lesson that now echoed inside Carter's mind. Titles fade. Uniforms come off. But character remains. Carter looked toward Marcus again, the earlier confidence in his posture replaced by a quiet respect. "Chief Bennett," he said carefully. Marcus gave a small smile at the title. "Just Marcus is fine these days," he replied. Carter nodded slowly, accepting the correction. I appreciate what you shared with me this morning, Carter said. I did not expect my shift to begin with a lesson like this. Marcus chuckled softly, not in mockery, but with the calm understanding of someone who had spent many years watching young officers grow into their roles. Most important lessons never arrive when we expect them, Marcus said. Carter glanced around the park once more. The father and his son were now walking toward the exit path, the boy still glancing back at the pigeons with excitement. A pair of older women had taken seats on a nearby bench, chatting quietly while sipping coffee from paper cups. The park felt alive with ordinary moments, each one peaceful and simple. Carter looked back at Marcus. I will remember this, he said. Marcus studied him for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity behind those words. Then he nodded. That is all anyone can ask, he replied. Carter hesitated slightly before speaking again. May I ask you something? Marcus gestured lightly for him to continue. Carter shifted his weight, choosing his words carefully. After all your years in the department, what do you think matters most for an officer to remember? Marcus looked out across the park again, taking a slow breath as if drawing from decades of memory. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet clarity of experience. The badge is a symbol, he said, but the way you treat people is the message they carry home. Carter listened closely. Marcus continued, his eyes resting on the open sky above the trees. Most people will forget the exact rules you enforce. They will forget the details of the situation, but they will never forget whether they felt respected when they stood in front of you. Carter absorbed every word. The moment felt less like a conversation and more like a quiet passing of wisdom from one generation of officers to the next. Marcus finally turned back toward him. Remember something simple, he said calmly. Every encounter you have is a chance to show someone what the law truly represents. Carter nodded slowly. Marcus then stepped away from the bench and began walking toward the park path. After a few steps, he paused and glanced back with a gentle expression. And sometimes, Marcus added softly, the person you meet will teach you more about justice than any training manual ever could. Carter watched as Marcus Bennett continued down the path, blending into the peaceful movement of the morning crowd. The retired chief soon disappeared beyond the line of trees, leaving only the quiet park behind. Officer Daniel Carter remained standing near the bench for a moment longer, listening to the soft flutter of wings as a pigeon landed nearby. The lesson of the morning echoed clearly in his thoughts. A badge might give someone authority, but the true measure of justice is revealed in the respect they choose to show when